some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that her
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
We left.
more of a community.
Before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
More than 5,000 people will die of AIDS today. An estimated 25 million people have died from HIV-related causes since the beginning of the pandemic. Such staggering statistics signal that dramatic efforts are needed, but progress is slow. Ambassador Stephen Lewis says it is absolutely possible to turn the pandemic around. What's lacking is the sense of emergency. Lewis is the co-founder and co-director of AIDS Free World, an international advocacy organization that aims to drive progress in the fight against AIDS by defending what works and exposing what doesn't. Lewis spent 20 years with the United Nations, first as Canadian ambassador, then as deputy director of UNICEF, and finally as the UN Secretary General's special envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa. He was appointed a Companion of the Order of Canada for lifetime achievement, and in 2005 he was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. Here's our conversation with Stephen Lewis. Stephen Lewis, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much.
You made your first visit to Africa after leaving university, quitting in a way university back in 1959, I think it was. And you have subsequently been to the majority of the 53 countries on the continent of Africa. Describe the Africa you first experienced back in 1959, early 1960s.
It was an Africa filled with optimism and hope. It was progressively becoming independent. I went first to Ghana, and it had become independent just a couple of years earlier. And there was a tremendous exaltation in everyone you met. Africa's a remarkably musical continent. One doesn't know that until one gets there, but everybody is musically inclined, so there's tremendous dancing and singing and drumming and theatrics. It's tremendously appealing, and the idea of the natural throbbing hope of the continent coming together with independence and freedom from colonial oppression was everywhere palpable. It was tremendous to be on the continent at that time. And the subsequent decline in so many countries is terribly painful. But in those days, I was completely caught up with. I was just a young punk foraging out in the wild and loving every minute of it. And I taught a little, although I had no credentials, it was entirely bogus. But I taught a little and wandered a lot and drove across the continent and really fell in love with Africa, which has been a love affair that's lasted to this day.
It's interesting because people who've been to the continent of Africa, they talk about it as their ancestral home, that it's in our DNA, and it sounds like it's almost natural that if you're lucky enough to make the visit, it does get into your bones.
Yes, I don't think I've ever met anyone who's visited Africa without an impact on his or her life. It's amazing. It's infectious.
Can you contrast the Africa that you were introduced to back in the early 60s and the Africa you see when you visit today?
Well, I spend the majority of my time when I visit today in the high prevalence countries of the pandemic of HIV/AIDS. So the human toll, the human carnage is intense. And it's heartbreaking, I don't know how else to put it, to see a continent that was so vibrant at community level. That was the great strength of Africa, that at the grassroots, at the communities, there was such intensity and camaraderie and solidarity and generosity of spirit, people working together in the best sense. And now, of course, they have been decimated by the virus. So many have died, so many orphans left behind, so many grandmothers who've buried their own children and look after their orphan grandchildren. They're beginning to come out of it, but it has taken a terrible toll in the psyche of the people, in the economic and social well-being of the society and the political behavior. It's tough to visit Africa now because in so many parts of the continent, it's hard to cope. On the other hand, it remains vibrant, and there are many people who feel that it will come back again, but it's been a long haul and a dreadful toll in the process.
Speaking of political behavior, countries around the world base their policy toward Africa on the Millennium Development Goals, something that you're keenly interested in. There are 8 UN goals that have been established, and the target dates for them to be met is 2015.
Right.
Just around the corner.
Right.
And it looks as if not one of those goals, beginning with reducing poverty or cutting poverty in half to work on HIV/AIDS, it looks as if none will be satisfied. Tell us a little bit about those goals and why we haven't had more success.
The goals are predictable. They were decided on at the Millennium Summit in the year 2000, and it was the reduction of poverty and maternal mortality and infant mortality, and an attempt to approximate gender equality and to get all kids into primary school and to handle the pandemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and deal with environmental questions and forge a relationship between North and South, which would be, if not an equal partnership, at least a respectful partnership. And what's happened, I think, is that you've had a combination of external shocks, like the most recent financial crisis and the soaring rise in food prices and the toll this takes on people who are already impoverished and hungry. You've had a very cynical view on the part of the G8 countries in particular, the major international powers that have made promises and never fulfill them. And you've had pretty weak leadership from the United Nations. For me, that's the most painful. I'm a person who's committed to multilateralism. I have tremendous faith in the United Nations. I hate it when I have to criticize the United Nations lest it give the berserk right wing an opportunity to do the same. But I must say that it's very disappointing that the leadership that should come from the major international organization in the world is now hardly evident at all. The present Secretary General is pretty limited in his impact. And even before, with a very good Secretary General like Kofi Annan, it was difficult to mobilize the constituent parts of the UN. So you've had a kind of conspiracy at work where external shocks and indifference and inertia on the part of the G8 countries and the policies of the UN itself have all conspired to make life difficult for the African continent in attempting to achieve the goals.
Promises made and promises broken is the way you outline it in your book, Race Against Time. Why are no countries held accountable for the promises that they made? And the promise was 0.7% of GDP or GNP, and very few countries have met that. Yes,
in fact, not a single G8 country has come close to meeting it, although the United Kingdom will probably get there by the year 2015. Countries that are that strong, you know, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, they just thumb their noses at the world. If you don't meet it, you don't meet it. That promise was made in 1969 initially and then confirmed 1,000 times at the UN since then. The United States, for example, has only now reached 0.2 rather than 0.7. You're not even a third of the way along, and yet people congratulate the United States at the contributions it makes internationally. Well, of course one must salute countries that do good things, but relative to what should be done, it's appalling.
I want to talk about money on the ground, and one of the things you point out in Race Against Time, which is really a compilation of a number of speeches that you gave for the CBC Macy Lecture Series. But you talk about if the United States contributes $3 billion to Africa, $1 billion actually makes it for the purpose it was intended. What happens to the phantom $2 billion that was allocated?
You certainly picked up on something that is not terribly creditable to any country. The person who's done the best work on this is Jeffrey Sachs, the brilliant economist who is at Columbia at the Earth Institute. Jeffrey made the argument, and many others of us have picked up on it, that so much money goes to transportation and to consultants in particular.
Reports.
And to reports and to conferences and to meetings and to major analyses and equipment and materials that are in the United States or in Canada. That, you know, we may pay a country $1 million, but we want much of it spent in our own countries and then imported. And so as a result, much of the aid is phantom aid. It never really gets to the ground. It never really gets to the purpose that's intended. Everybody said, oh, that's because of the corrupt leadership in Africa. And there is a lot of corruption in Africa. No one denies it. But it's nothing compared to the way we twist and distort the aid that we dispense.
Now, you are on one hand a critic of the UN and an apologist on the other hand. This is the organization that you love. Past Secretaries General have called for reforms. You think reforms need to be made. Where do we start? What kinds of changes are necessary if the UN is going to be a viable institution that other countries take seriously?
I think one has to divide the UN into the political considerations that flow from the Security Council and the tremendous power and trade-offs that occur when you're dealing with international issues from Afghanistan to Iraq to the Middle East to development aid. And then there are the agencies, the UNICEFs and the UNDPs and the Fund for Population Activities and the World Health Organization, and that whole vast complex of agencies which does tremendous work on the ground and which are deeply appreciated. We tend to be intensely critical of the UN because of the Security Council and the strange way it behaves in making capricious decisions in self-interest. The 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France, they dictate terms for the world through the Security Council. The agencies on the ground require strong leadership in order to be effective. And that's what's been lacking. Let me take a slight digression, but it will interest you. On July the 2nd last, the United Nations agreed, after 4 years of tremendous struggle, to create the first ever new international agency for women. It's thrilling. It's the most important thing that place has done in the last 50 or 60 years because women were always depreciated, diminished, ignored, discriminated against. The UN didn't discover there were 2 genders until 10 minutes ago. But finally they created a new international agency for women, and the key is who leads it. So what's the process? It's secretive. Nobody knows who the candidates are. Nobody knows when they're being interviewed. If I speak to a forum at Penn State, nobody in the audience will know there's a women's agency or that somebody in that audience could have applied to be Undersecretary General. It's all the horse trading amongst countries. You don't know that you're getting the best and most qualified candidate. Ban Ki-moon, the present Secretary General, promises transparency, and he's addicted to secrecy. The thing that is required about the UN is that the key countries insist on honorable behavior, scrupulous behavior, principled behavior, or there's too much fooling around. You may be very lucky and get a tremendous representative of a given agency on the ground in a given country. Everything then works. But unless there's leadership at the top, it doesn't work.
And you have been fighting for an agency for women for a number of years.
Yes.
Women, you say, do the work in Africa. They suffer the greatest consequences in Africa. In fact, it sounds to me like your heart breaks for women every time you land in Africa.
But they are the soul of the continent. They keep the continent together. I now work significantly with an organization called AIDS Free World, which is the organization in the United States that I co-direct. And I co-founded it and co-directed now with a woman named Paula Donovan, who lives in Boston. And she is the author of the Women's Agency. It was Paula who first recommended the Women's Agency and then fought for it tenaciously for the last 4 or 5 years when it looked as though the UN might indeed agree. And she too has had tremendous African experience. And we all weep for the neglect of women generally internationally, whether it's international sexual trafficking on one hand or economic empowerment on the other. It has been a historical pattern of discrimination and stigma where women are concerned. And frankly, unless the UN takes this seriously, unless the UN starts with $1 billion a year and operational capacity on the ground and an Undersecretary General who will really make an impact, all of us hoped it would be Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, but it looks as though she's not going to enter the realm. Unless that happens, then women will continue to struggle and be neglected and be persecuted on the ground.
And when it comes to AIDS, women, especially the age group between 15 and 19, I believe, are the most severely impacted.
Generally speaking, most severely impacted. Nearly 70% in Africa, over 60% of all the infections are amongst women. But if you look at that 15, it's actually 15 to 24-year-old age group, then 70 to 80% are young women and girls. Women are hugely vulnerable because there is no gender equality. There is no sexual autonomy. So they have no right to say to a man, wear a condom, or I don't want sex. What is startling, almost beyond belief, is that the greatest vulnerability for the women of Africa is in marriage, where young women marry older men and
who have a number of partners.
Have had many partners, and they have no right in the marriage to demand either fidelity or the wearing of a condom or safe and protected sex. And so the women get infected, and they get infected in these hugely disproportionate numbers. And it drives you crazy that the world will not respond adequately to this particular dilemma. And the dilemma then is compounded by patterns of sexual violence. Indeed, I guess AIDS Free World, my little organization, has been consumed by dealing with sexual violence over the last several years, whether it's politically orchestrated in Zimbabwe by a lunatic like Mugabe, or whether it is in the conflict area like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where just a month ago there were terrible episodes of raping. 600,000 women have been raped in the Congo over the last several years in the most brutal, maniacal of fashions, and the world has yet to respond.
How do you explain that when you know you can watch American television, for example, and the entire country will be in a frenzy over a single death?
Yes.
Or a handful of people, and here we're talking literally about millions, and about a continent where 8-year-old children are the head of a household.
That occurs when both parents have died of AIDS, and you have a child-headed household where the oldest sibling in the family looks after the younger siblings. You're quite right. I've been in homes where 8-year-olds are heading that household. The degree of marital rape and domestic violence and sexual violence in conflict and through political opportunism is staggering, and I don't quite know how to explain it. I don't know how to explain the dementia that is alive that allows men to do what they do. But I do know that we have an organization called the United Nations. We have in the Congo the single largest peacekeeping force in the world, close to 20,000 peacekeepers. The terrible violence is confined in large measure to the eastern Congo, to an area called North Kivu and South Kivu. It should be possible if one took this seriously. We have 12 UN agencies on the ground. I mean, if one really moved in on it, you could stop it, but the policies are so perverse. The indifference is so widespread. It's all so rhetorical. Everybody's outraged, and all we do is run in and provide the medical response to the raping, which of course is necessary, desperately necessary, but you've got to prevent the rapes from happening. And the Security Council is constantly saying that's the mandate of the peacekeeping forces, and the mandate is never exercised.
There's a rage underneath when you talk, and I'm just wondering, how do you remain optimistic? Because at the end of the day, you say we can defeat AIDS.
Because frankly, I don't want to alienate your entire audience with what I'm about to say, but I'm a democratic socialist. I have a very deep ideological conviction. I may say in Canada that's very boring and mainstream, so no one should have a cardiac arrest because I've used the word socialist. I'm a social democrat. I have a set of convictions. I'm driven by an ideology. It's an ideology that believes that if you fight strongly enough and hard enough and determinedly enough for social justice and for gender equality, then one day the pendulum will swing. One day things will turn around. And the beauty of Africa lies in the strength, particularly of its women, at the grassroots and at community level. And you know, if you keep working at it, AIDS is taking a terrible toll. There's still 10 million people who require treatment, and it's not immediately apparent when that treatment's going to happen or where the money's going to come from. But we know that if we keep at it, we can shift the ground. And that's where my optimism comes from. Sure, I'm in a rage. I live a life of rage. My wife was a feminist columnist for 25 years, and the definition of a columnist is that you get up in the morning and fly into a rage. and I have had a lot of rage and despair in my life, but I've also recognized that things aren't immutable, that they can change, they can be fixed, and that's what sustains me.
You spent 20 years with the UN. You worked on climate change, international relationships. Why is it that you settled on HIV/AIDS?
Oh, I think that's fairly straightforward. In terms of HIV and AIDS, I had the tremendous privilege of being the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF from 1995 to 1999. And in that capacity, my response was programming, looking at the programs internationally in many countries. And one of the things that became increasingly apparent was that whenever we thought we were making great strides for the infants and children of Africa, we ran into this wall where we were curtailed, we were abridged, we were stalled, we were sabotaged by the AIDS virus, killing children, turning them into orphans, making life impossible. And I left UNICEF for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons was I wanted to do more on HIV as a result of what we'd seen. You know, you'd go through the pediatric wards of hospitals. It just tore your heart apart.
4 and 5 infants in one crib.
And dying on a regular basis every few minutes. You know, you just wonder whether the world has gone mad, that with all of the sophistication and capacity as we move into the 21st century, we're still not able to save those little infants. So I wanted to do more on AIDS. I spent some time working with the executive director of UNAIDS, and then unexpectedly, out of the blue, Kofi Annan said, because we'd been friends when I was the Canadian ambassador, Kofi Annan said, "Stephen, I know you care about Africa. Would you like to be the first envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa and represent me on the continent?" And I said it would be an incredible privilege and threw myself into the work.
AIDS was first introduced to the American public some 30 years ago.
Yes.
What progress have we made? And could these mothers and their babies who are getting AIDS through birth, through transmission from mother to child, could they be saved? I mean, what do we know?
We know absolutely that we've made progress, because in 2003 there were 50,000, 100,000 people in treatment. Now there are over 5 million. We have discovered, it would seem, a microbicide, a foam or a cream or a gel that is vaginally applied that can prevent transmission of the virus. Indeed, they're now testing a ring that can be inserted and that can discharge the necessary prevention over a period of 3 months, so a woman can engage in sexual activity and not be infected. We have some hope around a vaccine for the first time, which is really thrilling. There's a sense that young people, youth in particular, are beginning to respond to the messages of behavior change. We're looking at the high-risk groups, men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users, and trying very hard to deal with those high-risk groups in ways that will curtail the spread of the virus. So on so many fronts, there have been very strong advances. We are now into the financial crunch. All of these things could be dealt with, including the prevention of the transmission of the virus from mother to child during pregnancy, the birthing process, or breastfeeding, if the mother is put on full antiretroviral treatment, not confined to one drug which may prejudice her life, which is the case now in so many instances, but full antiretroviral treatment, and the child has some treatment when it emerges, and you continue the treatment through 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, and you can reduce, as we've done in the United States, Canada, and the Western world, you can reduce transmission by 99%. It's incredible. So no infant has to emerge HIV positive, and the mother is saved. The mother is considered as important as the infant.
You've had mothers say to you, "I'll do everything to save my child, but what about me?"
Exactly, and there was a tendency in the world to focus entirely on the infant. and simply make the mother expendable. Another example of how we deal with gender. You know, it's just constantly comes back to remind you that women are at the center of every struggle, and you have to be sensitive to that. I live in a feminist family. I love it. In any event, the truth is we could turn the corner, and we're now facing a financial crunch. And I'm loath to say, but must say, that the financial crunch in significant measure has been induced by the United States, by the reality that President Obama, who made very significant promises in the course of his campaign, has failed to deliver on those promises once he becomes president. And the amount of money we're talking about, an extra $1 billion a year for a 3-year period now for something called the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and adequate increases to the presidential initiative which George Bush introduced, that amount of money is so microscopic compared to what we spend on stimulus packages, on saving the banks, on paying the promotional devices, on terrorism, on oil spills, you name it. And we can't find that money to save millions of lives.
And you see it in the lives of real faces, people you actually have met.
Yeah, and I can't stand it. So that's another facet of the rage.
Thank you, Stephen Lewis, so much for talking with us.
It's been my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Stephen Lewis. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll find important links as well as additional video clips from this interview. I'm Patty Satalia. Join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you've enjoyed Conversations from Penn State and would like to purchase a DVD of this show or any of our other episodes, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you.
This has been a production of WPSU.